Had been.
Oh, okay, so we'd like to welcome, first of all, we'd like to welcome all of you. Some of you who are new and some of you who are returning. And we're very, well, I'm just admitting people as I'm talking. We're very pleased to have Ian Stern today as our lecturer about Maresha. I heard a lecture he gave, I think it was last spring or something like that, and I was just so transfixed that I think I wrote him that day, and would he lecture to our series? I know about Maresha in a couple different ways. As a rabbi, I was telling Ian that I've taken groups there 10 or 12 times, but it's just to me one of the most fascinating, maybe the most fascinating Hellenistic site. I don't know, in the southern Levant or something like, I mean, just so major. Ian has had a lot of hats. And his current hats are he's with the University of Haifa and HUC-JIR. He was the director of the Maresha Excavations. He says he's semi-retired. It doesn't really seem like it. It seems like he's very busy and doing a whole lot of things. Again, I don't want to take a long time because we're under certain time constraints. Some of us have a major Jewish holiday tonight. So without further ado, we're calling on Ian. And thank you very much for being with us.
Okay, well, first of all, I want to thank the organizers. I want to thank you, Rabbi Scolnic, Dr. Coskun, and Dr. Miller for actually participating in some of the feedback when we have time for that. Basically, what I want to do here is relate, or let's say, kind of bring everybody up to speed. That's basically what I'm saying. I'm going to start with some of the material from the Edomites, and then move from there into Maresha and the Idumeans themselves. There's clearly a connection between the two, but just to briefly give some background, again, of course, ancient literary sources mention the Edomite/Idumean ethnic cultural connections to Nabateans, Phoenicians, Syrians, Judeans, and Iron Age sites that you see in the slide over here. Whether it's Sela, Beara, Tawilan, etc. These have all been identified as Edomite, based primarily on the discovery of the onomasticon, the Edomite names, as well as the pottery and some of the script. Oops. There we go. Okay. There is similar evidence, okay, of Edomite settlement already starting in the 8th century in this area over here, in what we call the Beersheba Valley, the area of Arad, the area of Aroer, starting already, actually a bit earlier, but in the 8th century for sure, we can identify this material here. Tereni has identified her assemblage at Aroer, for example, as being an assemblage that was, whoops, sorry about that, but what you see right here, an assemblage of both Judahite material, and included in that same assemblage also Edomite material, both imported and locally made material. Also, we should also make a note that it's widely accepted the Edomite kingdom comes to an end in 552, basically during the campaign of Nabonid, going down on his way towards Arabia. And in fact, after that point, you don't really see the name of the Idumean god, which does appear in a lot of ostraka before that. You see it very rarely on the eastern side of the Arava Valley, whereas in the area over here and moving slightly to the north up to at least, let's say, Maresha, we'll start seeing an increase in the use of that name. I'll get into the significance of that a little bit later. Let's see here. Okay. In the Persian period, basically, you don't have Idumea yet as a distinct administrative unit. When the Persians take this area over, they will give a lot of the authority of running that area to the local Kedarite tribes, Arab tribes there, primarily because of their assistance in campaign by Cambyses in 525 BCE into Egypt. And this is significant for them because, again, they will control this area and, more importantly, the terminal port of Gaza for the incense trade. That's going to be very significant. But again, Idumea is not really mentioned yet in the sources. It becomes significant or important after the conquest of Alexander. And at that point in time, the area is then known as Idumea, and that's probably a reflection of the dominant ethnic group in that area. Now, what we're seeing here is actually Tel Maresha. Okay, this is the Tel itself. The area around it's the lower city. This was excavated by Bliss and McAllister between 1900 and 1902. This is the upper city, which is also the Tel. And all around the upper city, or the Tel itself, we find all of these subterranean complexes, which is part of what really makes Maresha what it is. It's one of its distinguishable characteristics. It's one of the reasons we're a World Heritage Site. And well, let's get a sense. Here, I'm going to show you a map of how many systems we have. Right here, this is really the most updated map. This will be coming out in a book that I'll be publishing. It'll come out this coming year. And what you're seeing, all the red dots are the 152 subterranean complexes that, that we've identified at Maresha. There may be more, but at the moment, based on all the surveys, all the excavations, everything we've done, this is the number of subterranean complexes we have. Only a small percentage of them have been excavated. And then, of course, we also have areas, let's say areas above the surface that have been excavated as well, but it's still a small percentage of the material. Again, I was speaking a little earlier, 14% of the subterranean complexes have been excavated, and I would say that approximately 5% of Maresha has been excavated. When we look at it in terms of, we have to understand that when we excavate a complex, we might just do a few rooms, but if we look at the total amount of material that's there, it's approximately 5%. That's an important caveat in terms of understanding what we understand. That is to say, there's much more to learn at Maresha, and again, we'll be getting into some of that in a second. Now, the subterranean areas, okay, all over the place, right? Why? And the answer is you have a certain geological formation here. Without going into a lot of detail, there's a layer about 1.5 meters thick of very hard rock called Nari. And the ancients understood if they could penetrate through, make a shaft wide enough for a person or two to get through, they'll hit a very soft, chalky material called kirtone. They use this as a basis to build their homes on the surface. And basically, every single home underneath it has a subterranean area beneath it. And what you're seeing beneath the diagram here, or the drawing, are just some examples. You can see these lines over here, and these are simply quarry marks, which give you the size of the bricks that they were using to build their homes. You can see the negatives of the bricks, the next bricks that would be taken out on the floor on the photo to the right. And this was the source. And in fact, the reason we have so many caves primarily is because this was a source of building material. People generally build their homes with local materials, and the local material kirtone is something that people are going to be using. By the way, chalk is not the most durable material, and therefore what you also have is a phenomenon of the caves constantly getting larger, meaning they're constantly quarrying more and more of the caves to repair their homes or to expand the homes or build new homes on the surface. Now, this is just to give you a sense of perhaps what the area looked like, obviously an artist's version of it, but here would be the upper city surrounded by all the homes. But the most important point here is to understand that underneath each of these homes, there is a subterranean complex that was going to accessed primarily by very, very lovely staircases. You'd go in, you'd enter in via a dromos. This is area 53. This opening over here, this was a 2-story home, by the way. The entranceway over here, here's a close-up of it. Really a sense of, a highly developed sense of aesthetics, I would say, and very nice, let's say, built arches. And this is typical of the architecture in Maresha. Even in the subterranean areas, there's a real focus on aesthetics, cornices, recessed pilasters, et cetera, all around. And again, that's one of the things that makes this site so special. Now, to understand better the whole idea of the amount of rooms or subterranean complexes, I've given two examples here. A subterranean complex could have one or two rooms, which is what you see in the lower drawing over there, or lower plan. You have an entranceway, and then you have a staircase into a cistern. Most people want cisterns underneath their homes after they've poured it away. And then you have subterranean complex 89 over here, which we're still excavating. And this has, at the moment, 82 rooms in it. Now, I say 82 rooms, I know there are more. I know there are more because we have rooms that are doorways, let us say, that are completely blocked off. They're bricked up, they're closed. We haven't gone through them because we haven't even completed the 82 rooms over here. So I'm saying 82 rooms that we've identified. Within this, it's not like you had one home on top and you had an 82 room basement, but rather you had probably, I don't know, a few dozen homes on top, and each of these were different systems. So I believe there are about 427 systems within all of the complexes. Some of them are, like at the bottom here, a single system. And in this case here, we have about 15 systems. Let's just kind of give an example. Here's an entrance over here, and you get into these different rooms. This is where we found the largest archive ever discovered in Israel. Here's another entrance into an olive press, a different system. And the numbers are just giving you a sense of, let's say, the complexity of the area and really the enormity of the area as well. Now, while most of these subterranean rooms were simply quarries, others were converted into functional rooms. One of the most important of those rooms is cisterns, okay? And we have identified quite a few of them. One of the most important rooms, okay, basically almost all of them have these spiral staircases that you see. But how we've identified a cistern, because there are a lot of rooms with spiral staircases, so that's not the defining factor. The defining factor is, number one, the stone here is not permeable to water, but sometimes cracks occur. And so if we find a room that has a staircase like this and has cracks that have been plastered, we'll identify that as a cistern. If there are channels that bring water into the cistern, okay, this is bringing water into a lower cistern here. This cistern's channel we cannot see, but it's actually over here. And so if there's a channel that's directing water in, then that would also be qualify as a cistern. And sometimes we have rope marks. We don't see them here, but when you would lower your jar on a rope, instead of going all the way down, and the erosion or the friction would cause these marks on the side of the banister in some of the banisters. It's not visible on the one I'm showing you here. The water source for all of this is rainwater. Okay, rainwater that would then be channeled in either from the courtyards or from the rooftops. Basically, everybody would be channeling as much water as they possibly could into these cisterns. And that's, let's say, I would say that's the primary type of functional room we have. Although, as I said before, the majority of the rooms underground were simply quarries. Another, let's say, functional type of room would be olive presses, 25 of them, as you see here. And this is an olive press that's kind of a nice one in a way. I mean, you've got a area where you have your crushing basin. You'd have a crushing stone, maybe sometimes two crushing stones. A beam would be placed there, and a person or a donkey, or a few people or a donkey would be pushing it around. This is where the initial crushing took place. The crushed olives placed in baskets would then be brought over to this area over here, or if we look, this is a close-up of it. They would be placed one on top of another, and then there would be a beam going over it. It would attach to the stone weights in front, and pressure applied, and that pressing area would then cause the oil and water combination to ooze out into vats in front, and then the oil would raise to the top, and you'd ladle that off. Also notice that many of the caves, or many of the olive presses have cultic niches, okay, between the pressing stations. We find them in lots of different areas, but this is part of the cult. And again, we have this has been, you can see that these have been worn out, kind of overused. But there are some systems and some presses where you can actually see they were hardly used, and the lines are still there from the people who drew the lines, so the quarriers would know where to quarry. It's quite amazing. Another major issue, or sorry, major industry were the columbaria, dovecotes. 84 of them we've identified. Pigeon raising was a big deal at this period of time, primarily because you need those pigeons or doves for sacrifice. Number two, they're a source of protein, you could consume them. And maybe most importantly, the guana from the pigeons was collected, and it was an important fertilizer. It was nitrogen rich, and it was used in the cultivation of olive trees, for example. By the way, these are not, sometimes in Rome you will see columbaria, and they are defined many times as a place where you place the ashes of the dead, or an urn containing the ashes of the dead. We do not have those types of columbaria. We do not have cremation of the dead. It's almost non-existent in Israel, and where it does exist, it's usually in a Roman place where a Roman army would have been based, like in, I don't know, Ketef Hinnom near Jerusalem. Now, how can we understand the ethnic makeup of the city? Let's get into some of the more, let's say, interesting stuff. An important indicator of the ethnic makeup of Maresha is its onomasticon. That's the names that we have found. And we've been fortunate enough to find over 1,200 ostraca at Maresha. And if I include the amount of ostraca that, let's say, what's his name? Betzalel Porton and Adi Yardeni have published, primarily from, let's say, hoards that were from shops, and others they were not found in situ, but we definitely get a sense of who was living in Idumea at this time. And I can say from the names, and again, the names are not an absolute indicator, right? Names can be, let us say, well, I'll take my own name, Ian. It's not a typical Jewish name. So in a period of time when where people are cooperating, getting along very well, then you might have people using other people's names, and I'll get into that in a second. But it's clear that you have a certain majority of people in Idumea who have Arabic names, Idumean names, and the most frequent of the ways we identify the names is from what we call a theophoric. That is to say, the inclusion in the name of one of the deities. So that, for example, in the top left-hand corner, you can see in Aramaic the name Kos Natan. Kos is the Idumean god, Natan gave, and let us say the Judahite or Judean equivalent of that would be Yehonatan or Jonathan. Yehonatan, Yahweh, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh gave. Okay, and that's one of the more simple ways of doing it, but there are other ways as well. But in any case, we're getting a sense of the ethnic makeup of the city to some extent from the onomasticon. It goes beyond this as well. By the way, as I said before, Kos is appearing as the most frequently named deity named in this area. We do not see him almost at all on the area of, let's call, Old Edom, in the area of, let's say, on the eastern side of the Arava Valley. Now, what's also interesting is if we look at the prosopography, the intergenerational relationships. So again, Porton and Yardeni did a lot on this, I myself as well. But if we look at the published Aramaic Idumean dossiers that have been found, it provides us, in some cases, I think about 130 cases, lists of intergenerational names. To cite just one example, the one I've given right here is the example of a clan called Yehokal. Yehokal is clearly a Yahwistic or Judahite clan, or at least the head of the clan is Judahite. And this, by the way, corresponds pretty well with Strabo's description of the close ethnic and cultural relations between the various ethnic groups, and noting that the social relations included close contact based on intermarriage. Now, there are many different examples, but if we look right here, 44% of the sons or members of this clan had clearly Idumean names. 22 had Arabic or Nabatean names, 11% Egyptian names, and 22 were unidentifiable, and none of them maybe most importantly, didn't carry a clear Judaic name. This is what Barth would have called a very good example of low ethnic boundary maintenance. I mean, it appears that coexistence under the Persians and later under Ptolemaic rule did not provoke a competitive atmosphere that might have precluded cooperation or mixing of cultures. It was a period when the significance of specific ethnic symbols appears to have become blurred. So this is, again, let's say, Persian period going into the Ptolemaic period. Now let's move to some of our finds. What we have in Maresha is an incredibly prosperous, cosmopolitan city that was very much involved in trade throughout the world, or at least throughout the Mediterranean and a little bit beyond that. So what we're seeing here are some examples of what we call Phoenician pendants, what's referred to as grotesque heads. We've got Egyptian influence with the faience here. You've got Achaemenid influence with these different gold earring and other gold elements. And you, of course, have Greek influence at this period of time as well. But beyond that, you also have Nabatean or Arabic influence. You've got, let's say, bowls from Megaria, from, let's say, the west slope of Athens here. Here's from the Black Sea. And most interesting for me, at least, is this this applique that's made of camel bone. But they were made of bone, and sometimes they were made of from ivory. And they were, let's say, part of maybe a piece of furniture or something. But what's interesting here is what this is portraying. This is clearly a mythological scene that's very identifiable, certainly to the inhabitants, I would imagine, of the home from which this came. What we have is the abduction of Ganymede, or sometimes referred to as the rape of Ganymede, the most handsome man in the world, right over here, and the eagle, which is simply a form of Zeus. He has come down to earth to abduct Ganymede to Olympus. But leaving the story aside, what it really portrays, at least in my mind, is that the inhabitants of Maresha were also very involved in Hellenistic culture. They understood this. This was something that was part of, who they were. Now, in the beginning of the 2nd century, basically there is a major change, because in the battle in 199 of the Battle of Panias, the Seleucids defeat the Ptolemies. And what we can see, at least in Maresha, is clear signs of an intensification of Hellenizing efforts by the new Seleucid rulers. Avner Ecker, who's worked on most of our Greek material, has shown that the year 199, in that year, there was an abrupt change that may reflect the first government measures towards Hellenizing the local peoples under Seleucid rule. Okay, and here are a number of examples, just pulling out a few. We have inscribed lead weights. This was analyzed actually by Gerald Finkelstein. We have this is a sarcoma over here, which is a vessel that is used to measure volume of liquids. But what's important here is, again, not really visible here, but is the Greek term agaronomos, or actually agaronomai, was a number of them that are mentioned, and their names. We have a number of, quite a few, Greek amphora stamps in the archive that we discovered a few years ago. Again, the largest private archive ever to be found in Israel. Among the different sealings, amongst the bulot that we discovered, a number of them contain the title Creophylax, which means the person in charge of the archive. And of course, we have the famous Heliodorus inscription. Actually, we have 2 copies of it. We have this copy here and a second copy that was found, let's say, well, it was found in the 70s, and that was found in the 50s, returned to the department. Found what I mean, it was found in the context of, let us say, a Moshe Dayan discovery. Someone was going through there, found this inscription, took it to their kibbutz. The story goes that he was then brought it in the 70s. The Department of Antiquities gave amnesty to anybody who had found things and allowed them to bring them back without any penalty. This very good Samaritan brought it back. It was put inside the the warehouse of the departments, not to be discovered until after we actually had found our version of Heliodorus, but it's a second copy, which really, I guess, underlines how important that was, and we'll get to that maybe in a second. Now, our discoveries suggest that the residents of Maresha also shared certain behavioral characteristics, or what we might call ethnic markers, particularly, although not exclusively, with their neighbors to the south in Nabatea and in the north in Judea. Some of these similarities can be explained simply as being examples of generic Semitic behavior, common to many ethnic groups in the area. But sometimes it's difficult to distinguish which ethnic markers belong to which ethnic group or groups. And it might be helpful for us to, let's say, enumerate some of the commonalities that we've noticed, at least in Maresha. And the first one I'm depicting here, of course, is pig avoidance. Lee Perry Gall actually did an analysis of all our faunal remains, and she said, or she shows, that only a small percentage of the bones are pig bones. Now, we got to keep in mind that pig avoidance, while it has been interpreted as an ethnic marker, usually associated with the people of Judea, was also a behavior that was shared with other Semitic peoples as well. So I say this as something that we keep in the back of our minds. We also found quite a few stone phalli, which are not strange perhaps in any Greek male statue, but all of ours, interestingly enough, are circumcised. Okay, and that, of course, circumcision is many times, again, associated with the Judean population, but once again, it is also something that is understood as a Semitic feature shared by lots of ethnic groups in the Levant and beyond. Their presence at Maresha, I would say, could be understood to suggest an acceptance of circumcision by at least part of the population. We can't say much more than that. But we'll get back to this because this is significant when we get to something I'll be discussing a little bit later. While not ubiquitous, what can be described as certain aniconic tendencies, and they may reflect a shared cultural trait with some of the other groups around, like the Nabateans and the Judeans. This tendency is very noticeable in one of Maresha's most unique finds, and that's what you're seeing here in this slide, and that is Kernos lamps. In this case here, in complex 169, we found over 780 lamps, intact lamps. I'm not even talking about fragments here. And of those, half of them were Kernoi. But unlike other Kernoi found in other areas, all of these, okay, are aniconic. There are no anthropomorphic or zoomorphic images on this, which is very, very different. We know these were locally made. We know that because we found wasters, in other words, seconds that didn't fill apart, let's say, in the kiln, or from petrographic analysis. So these were clearly let's say, local element, and we believe that they had some sort of ritualistic function, although what the ritual was, we don't know. This aniconic tendency is also quite visible in the altars. You see the altar on the bottom left and the bottom right. They're rather aniconic. You have a Hermes relief in one of the caves that looks like a cross. Initially, Bliss and McAllister thought this was a Christian sanctuary. We know today that it was not. This is some sort of a Hermes statue. And you can also see this semi-anthropomorphic tendency within the Hellenistic-styled pillar figurines that you see on top here. Okay, so this is a tendency. I'm not saying we do not have anthropomorphic and zoomorphic figures. We clearly do, but this tendency also exists alongside of that. Also important to note, the Idumean god Kos, his image remains ambiguous. There is no clear evidence of Kos veneration that has been discovered to date, although theoretically, he may have been depicted in a schematic or aniconic manner, as shown in these altars or in some other manners that I'm not presenting right now because of time. Another, let's say, interesting find is, of course, the discovery of this 7 shards, 7 ostraca that fit together. It's part of a marriage contract. It was worked on by Professor Esti Eschel and Professor Amos Kloner. This is an Idumean marriage contract based on the names that we have here, Kosram and Kosyad. dated to 176 BCE. But what's interesting, of course, is it has some very interesting, let's say, parallels to Judean marriage contract discovered in the Judean desert. One of the most important things, though, that I'm finding is that we have discovered 77 baths at Maresha, and they all contain channels that can only be filled from outside. So if you're looking right here, this is, let's say, a kind of a gutter. Someone from outside would fill this or pour water over here. That water would then come out on this side. This is the inner portion of this bath, flow along the channel, and spill onto someone who had been sitting on this bench. This hole was a breach that was made later in history, not important to our discussion right now. The baths are, let's say 95% of the baths are found near or in the vicinity of a cistern, okay? But they're all subterranean. They're all below ground. In this case, you have two baths. In this case, there's one. These are separate areas. And if I go to, let's say how these were designed, you can get a sense also here. We're coming from the surface down inside, and then you have either a bath where people could sit, and this is what would be a sitting bath, same idea of the channel and water pouring onto the person sitting here, or in the area on the right-hand side, you could actually have a bathtub. In either case, these were all built beneath the homes and had, in my opinion, some sort of yet to be defined ritual function. They have clear, okay, resemblance to Hellenistic hip baths or hip baths, or sometimes referred to as relaxation baths. They also very closely, let's say, resemble in many ways Phoenician bathing suites, but they're also essentially different from both of those. That is to say, Hellenistic relaxation hip baths are almost always in areas near a kitchen, near an area where there's a heating source, and this allowed them to use warm or hot water in those baths. Phoenician, let's say, bathing suites are almost always situated near the entrance to the home or near the courtyard. And according to Bernie, who did a lot of research on this and did a lot of work in Ashkelon, among many other places, concluded that the most distinguishing feature of the Phoenician bathing suite was their location in close proximity to the entrance or courtyard. The Mareshan baths do not have these characteristics. They are underground, they're away from heating sources, they're far away from the entranceways. So if it's not for relaxation and it's not part of a bathing suite, then what were they used for? Again, in my opinion, some sort of yet to be defined ritual function. Keep in mind that mikvaot, I'm not using the term mikvah deliberately because these are not mikvaot. These are not Jewish ritual baths, but we do not have mikvaot this early. They do not exist yet. So this is, let's say, at least 50 to 100 years before the earliest mikvaot that we find, let's say, in Jericho, for example. Now, the last thing I want to point out in terms of this type of stuff is punctured vessels. Again, a complete oddity. We have over 1,000 vessels that were deliberately punctured. And believe me, it is not easy to puncture vessels like this. I tried. I thought, in fact, originally that it was somebody who was excavating with us that actually made the hole. But in taking a couple of vessels, trying to make that hole is not easy. It requires a lot of work. You have to kind of scrape away and then you break through. We have it throughout our whole corpus. That is to say, not only do we have it in bowls or in cooking pots, we see it in invertaria, in storage vessels, in lamps. Now, if something like this was discovered in a Roman period site, let me put it differently. When things like this have been discovered in a Roman period site, it has been, let's say, referred to as an ethnic indicator and a clear sign that the people who were there were Judean. This, again, resembles the laws we read about in Mishnah Kelim Bet, referred to, let's say, the laws of purity laws or laws of purity, impurity, etc. Without going into all of it here, this is something that is a conundrum. I don't know how to explain it. The Mishnah is not going to be written for a couple of hundred years, but this is certainly a certain behavior that was related to something, possibly feasting. I cannot really say for sure, but its resemblance to, let us say, Judean behavior years later is something that we can't just dismiss. So in general, let me just say the following. I didn't mention ossilegium, meaning secondary burial, but we do have clear signs of secondary burial as well in Maresha, which is a type of burial that you see in Judea, but also among other Semitic peoples. We have circumcision, of course, I mentioned, pig avoidance, but you also have elements here that, let us say, are pre-Jewish, okay, pre-Judean. And that in of itself, I think, is interesting. And I hope at the end, I'll be able to, let's say, make a connection to all of this. Okay. Porton referred to this as Judean Idumean piety. That is to say, shared customs, although we don't necessarily know what the symbolism of these acts were for the Idumeans. We know they were doing certain things, but the symbolism, obviously, because we do not have the written sources, we have ostraka, but they're usually tags, they're, let's say, lists, they are maybe a contract, but they're not giving us the type of material that we get, let's say, from, let's say, Judean sources. At the second quarter, or by the second quarter of the 2nd century, things start to change, okay? Things are changing in this region. The tension between the Seleucid dynasty and the Judean population is clearly mentioned. We read about that, and it's highlighted in the stele you see on the right-hand side. By the way, the left is a small copy of it, and that is the Heliodorus stele. It is dated basically to the period of time around 176 BCE. And it's recalling the story of Heliodorus, okay, mentioned in Second Maccabees. And it's a period of time where there's a tremendous amount of pressure on the Seleucid dynasty due to the fact that they were defeated at the Battle of Magnesia in 189. And according to the Treaty of Apamea, they have to pay tribute to the Romans. This is putting a tremendous amount of pressure on the Seleucid dynasty, and they're now looking for ways of, let's say, collecting that money. This stele basically is talking about how, so it's giving the CV, the curriculum vitae of a man named Olympiodorus, with Heliodorus being mentioned. But really, the story that we read in Second Maccabees is giving us a sense of Heliodorus being sent to rob the temple, to take the money from that temple. The point I'm making here is tension is beginning. He is rebuffed, that the fact that he is sent away violently, depending on how we look at that story, obviously has an impact on the Seleucid ruler, at this time Seleucus IV, but not long afterwards, 3 years later, Antiochus IV Epiphanes is going to take over. Can this be the genesis of the Maccabean revolt? I think it's very, very possible. And if we add to this all the turmoil that's going on in the second century from this point on, that is to say, dynastic intrigues going on, this is all going to have an impact on Maresha. Okay, that is seen, and Gerald Finkelstein has shown that in his analysis of the amphora stamps, because what we see here is an amazing, a very dramatic decline in the amount of imported Rhodian amphora seals. Again, it's a sign that the economy is declining, and it's a reflection of the political instability at this period of time. Now, this is also very visible in, let's say, the underground or the subterranean areas. So that if I look at, let's say, let's take a look. The columbaria. Columbaria here, and this one over here, you can see that this one has been filled with debris. The one on the right was clearly quarried through. In other words, it was put out of use. It was decommissioned. 64% of the columbaria, by the time the city is abandoned, had been decommissioned. That means, again, this part of the economy was really going nowhere. 7 of the olive presses, 28% of them were decommissioned. That you see in the middle here, where it was just this area was quarried away. The press was probably no longer in use at that point. And most importantly, 90 of the 232 cisterns, almost 40% of the water cisterns are decommissioned, filled in, blocked up, etc. This basically is saying that we don't need that much water. That means you have to have less of a population. Maresha at its peak, we estimate, had about 10,000 inhabitants, which is pretty large. But again, by the time we get to the end of the second century, that is, say, when we get to the conquest by Hyrcanus, I'd say a sizable portion of that population have left. You can see some of the entranceways were blocked over here. We discovered this is a staircase, but it was completely blocked up deliberately. Here it's alluvium. Here it's simply me and a staff member, but this area was blocked. Part of it, some of them were blocked simply just by the flow of debris over 2,000 years. But again, a certain percentage, not a huge percentage, but a certain percentage were blocked up deliberately. Here you can see it again, another example right here of a blocked room. All of this is part of, I would say, the slow immigration of many of the inhabitants of Maresha elsewhere. Where did they go? Some went to the coast. Some may have gone to Judea. Some of them certainly went to Egypt. We have inscriptions in Egypt of an Idumean diaspora there as well. So we have people leaving, and this actually comes to an end, okay, in 112 BCE. In 112 BCE, the city is conquered by John Hyrcanus, the Hasmonean king. There was some dispute, even in my own publications, of what the exact date was. Today, it is conclusive. In 112/111 BCE, the city was abandoned. Now, what is that based upon? Well, number one, the first area, this area 53, in this little room over here underneath the floor, this small jar was discovered with these silver tetradrachmas, and the latest date of these coins was 112/111 BCE. So that was a date we were quoting for a while. But since then, there was a lead weight. On the lead weight that you see over here, Macedonian seal, has a date which was originally misinterpreted by Gerald Finkelstein. And hence, we were actually revising our dates in some of our publications to 107, 106 BCE. But today, he has actually revised his interpretation, and it's consistent with everything else we have. Again, 112/111 BCE. That is consistent with the latest of the sealings that we've discovered. They are the creophylax that I mentioned before, but again, the latest date on all of those, we found 1,027 sealings there. So it's an enormous archive, but the latest date is 112/111. It also corresponds to the dates of the coins and handles that we have discovered. It also corresponds to the latest grave or tomb inscriptions that we've discovered. So this is indisputable, at least from my point of view. Now, the Hasmonean policy towards pagan religions after they conquer was, well, it ranged from intolerant to hostile. And we have examples of that at Maresha as well. 9 of the niches or altars were defaced or, let's say, partially destroyed. Here you have a column that was thrown into one of the shafts here. So again, this is not atypical. We have examples of this nearby in Khibet al-Rassam or Khibet al-Muda. But again, examples of that. We do not have settlement in Maresha after that date. I'm not going to, I do say that it's clear that there was some sparsely habitation in the area, but the city as a city doesn't exist anymore. And the new city will eventually come up nearby, will be Iliothropolis/Beit Guvrin. Now, what's kind of interesting here is, of course, according to Josephus, the notion of this forced conversion takes place. I mean, he says, if we just go to the middle of it, that's underlined, after conquering the Idumeans, he gives them a choice. They would circumcise, if they circumcise their genitals and make use of the laws, meaning if they converted, then they could stay. again, we don't have examples of them actually staying, but I would also go so far as to say I think that we can take this whole portion of Josephus and put a big question mark there. It seems to me that the Idumeans already were practicing circumcision, or at least some of them were. Maybe this applies to those that weren't. But certainly certain things with the conquest by the Hasmoneans, Josephus' interpretation is a forced conversion. Strabo does not go along with this, by the way. Strabo says it's a voluntary conversion. But leaving that aside, I think what's really important to note is it's clear that they do convert. And I would cautiously suggest that the Hasmonean conquest of Idumea eventually results both in the integration of the Idumeans into the Judean polity, but at the same time, it also influenced the course of Judaism. Rarely does, let's say, influences, go in one direction. The integration of certain elements of the Idumean behavior from Maresha may represent a transitional stage in the evolution of Judaism at this time. The conquered ethnos became Idumean Judeans, just like you had Galilean Judeans, so to speak, a group that later chose to remain within Judea, even after Pompey gave them the option of autonomy. Later on, some of them will fight alongside the Judeans during the Great Revolt against Rome. So it appears to me that this sub-ethnic group eventually lost its distinctiveness and was absorbed over time within the Judean polity that was likewise affected. In other words, they adopt Judaism, or let me say it differently. I believe that they didn't really have to change much in the way of their actual actions, but the symbolism of those actions will morph or absorb some of the Judean interpretations, and at the same time, the Judeans will absorb some of that from the Idumeans themselves. So to kind of sum up, finally, we can say that the city was conquered in 112 BCE. There wasn't destruction. We don't have any destruction areas. We have some desecration in cultic areas. The city is abandoned. The Idumeans then emigrate to Egypt, the coast, and possibly Judea. They adopt Judean interpretation of some of these practices, become part of the polity. And again, as I said before, the Judeans absorbed and adopted some of the Idumean practices as well. Some maintain an Idumean ethnic identity. We do know of that. In the time of Herod, there is what's called the Cosboros affair. We do have some Idumeans who clearly continue to see themselves with that type of identity, but the majority, it seems, developed a zealous Jewish identity, and they were zealously fighting against the Romans during the Great Revolt. That's a lot. I covered a lot, maybe too much, but anyway, I look forward to comments.
Thank you so much, Ian. If we were in a lecture hall, I think there would be a storm of applause for such a spectacular presentation, which on the one hand was very clear, and on the other hand, it's raising in me so many questions. You've really aroused my curiosity, but we are in the lucky position that we have someone so much more suitable than me to start with expert feedback, and that is Dr. Stuart Miller, Professor Emeritus of Hebrew History and Judaic Studies at the University of Connecticut. He was chair in the Department of Literatures, Cultures, and Languages, and he also served as academic director of the Center of Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Lives. So throughout his career, his research has been marked by a very strong interest in combining material and archaeological evidence on the one hand with the literary tradition. That goes back to his PhD and his first book resulting from it, Studies in the History and Traditions of Sepphoris, published in 1984. And as a side remark, that's also the research project he's currently working on, an extension or a continuation of this book. And it's the same combination of approach is also seen in his second book, Sages and Commoners in Late Antique Eretz Israel, a philological inquiry into local traditions in Talmud Yerushalayimi, from 2006. And his third book, At the Intersection of Text and Material Finds, Stepped Pools, Stone Vessels, and Ritual Purity Among the Jews of Roman Galilee. So Stuart, thank you so much for taking on this role. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Before I begin, I'd like to thank Altay and Benjamin for inviting me to respond to Ian's presentation. I also want to thank Ian for his engaging research and remind him that he invited me some time ago to accompany him on a visit to Maresha, something I am very much hoping to take him up on, hopefully soon. My brief comments will focus on some of the practices Ian has spoken about that until the discoveries at Maresha, scholars largely associated with the Jews and their beliefs. As you have already gleaned from his presentation, the possibility that Idumean culture was closer to that of the Judeans than previously imagined has made their purported coerced circumcision under John Hyrcanus perhaps not so coerced after all. But Ian is offering a more intriguing bidirectional possibility, rather than starting with the premise that the practices in question were still largely unique to ancient Judaism. He is suggesting that Idumean culture may have also influenced that of the Jews. In Ian's words, quote, "It is wrong to think that the absorption of the Idumeans into the Judean polity would have only affected the Idumean population. This integration would have affected both ethnic groups, the conqueror and the conquered." End of quote. He continues, and I quote again, "The Hasmonean conquest of Idumea resulted both in the integration of the Idumeans into the Judean polity and at the same time influenced the course of Judaism. Although it is difficult to see circumcision and abstention from pig as anything more than practices that stemmed from earlier Israelite tradition, there is some validity to Ian's suggestion. I would like, however, to lend some further nuance to the dynamic he is proposing by referring to some themes in my own work, which similarly raises questions concerning ethnicity and identity. First, it is the weight of the cumulative evidence or composite evidence, not one specific type of find, that allows for the compelling argument Ian is making. In an article entitled "Stepped Pools, Stone Vessels, and Other Identity Markers of Complex Common Judaism," I argued that simplistic one-to-one correlations of material finds with distinct groups such as priests, Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, or later Jewish Christians and rabbis distort our understanding of Judaism in Greco-Roman Palestine. I am reminded of the time my wife and I were invited to the home of a non-Jewish colleague who had just moved into a new home. Upon noticing that my colleague had a double aluminum sink in her kitchen, my wife commented that the house must have been previously owned by Jews, likely Orthodox or traditional-minded Jews, who often prefer this setup as it allows for keeping the washing of dairy and meat vessels separate. My colleague responded that the home had only one previous owner who was not Jewish. The sink was just a very functional sink with no symbolic or ritual meaning. Had we thought about it further, the town in which our colleague lived was never really home to traditionally observant Jews. Returning to antiquity, chalkstone vessels were especially popular at the height of the Herodian period, when everything seemed to be made of stone. The rabbis later would maintain that stone vessels were impervious to impurity, which is the reason why most scholars believe chalkstone vessels were ubiquitous well into the 2nd century CE in Roman Palestine. But finding a lone vessel or even a collection of chalk vessels without other contextual evidence is not absolute proof of a home or community that belonged to Jews, never mind that they were observing rabbinic purity practices. On the other hand, chalkstone vessels found in the same home in proximity to other likely identity markers provide a more convincing scenario. Chalkstone vessels from the early Roman period were discovered in the northwest quarter of Upper Cephus in a domestic context that included earthenware from the known Jewish pottery center at Kfar Kananya, we know this from rabbinic sources, and also stepped pools, or what the rabbis would later call mikva'ot. We don't really know what they were called originally. The area was notably free of pig bone. Add to this that there is sufficient literary evidence that Sepphoris was largely Jewish from the late Hasmonean period on. It is hard not to conclude from all of this composite evidence that the neighborhood in question was distinctly Jewish. But I would not go further than that and identify these Jews as priests, Essenes, Pharisees, or early rabbis. I think you get my point. Nor do I think that all Jews using these vessels necessarily did so out of purity concerns. While the practices of these Jews might have belonged to a, quote, common Judaism of the period, I have borrowed from complexity theory and amended E.P. Sanders' original formulation, preferring complex common Judaism, which allows for the fuzziness that I believe characterized an ever-evolving way of life that eventually would be referred to as Judaism. This blurring of distinct sub-identities is important to keep in mind when assessing the material finds at Maresha. Even if the hybrid nature of Idumean culture and the complex common Judaism I have briefly described had much that kept them distinct. Rather than see Judean influence on Idumea or vice versa, I think there is more to be gained from regarding both identities as emerging from the same cultural milieu. To my mind, the most convincing examples of cultural contacts between Idumeans and Judeans are their bathing installations, perforated vessels, burial practices, and marriage contracts. I will of necessity limit my comments to the baths and vessels. The pools of Maresha, along with other hit baths such as the one at Horbat Ashun in the Modin Hills, are our earliest evidence of artificial pools in Greco-Roman Palestine. Stepped pools emerged slightly later, as you've already heard, certainly by the late Hasmonean period, circa 100 BCE. While the two types of bathing installations do not look entirely alike, with step pools more suitable for full immersion rather than partial washing, I am inclined to agree with Jonathan Adler that they were an architectural outgrowth of the sitting pools or hit pools at Maresha. Recently, Benjamin Gordon has argued that it is no accident that the emergence of step pools converges with the interest in the Hellenistic world in hygiene, hydrotherapy, and a preoccupation with miasma. Be that as it may, I doubt that either the Idumeans or the Judeans would have distinguished between physical and ritual washing when using their pools. Moreover, in all likelihood, they were influenced by long-entrenched ideas that developed closer to home. Both the Idumeans and the Judeans shared an indigenous culture that owed much to ancient Near Eastern perceptions of water as a life-giving and sustaining divine gift, hence its purifying qualities. The association of water with life can be documented from ancient Mesopotamia through the Tanakh, the New Testament, and the rabbis. Thus, the finds from Maresha provide evidence for both the evolution of the ritual bath, as well as the extent to which Judean and Idumean culture converged. We might even say we have here an early linkage of cleanliness to godliness, one that was rooted in a deeply entrenched Near Eastern worldview. The Hellenistic milieu may have played a part in the emergence of artificial pools, but again, much earlier indigenous notions of the divine origins of water and its associations with life prepared the ground for their introduction and their usage for ritual purity rites. I would make a similar case where the punctured vessels are concerned, but here it is anybody's guess as to what their original use was. As with chalkstone vessels, without the later rabbis, we would have no reason to think that they were perforated for any ritual purity or cultic reason. It would make just as much, if not greater sense, to assume that there was some practical, mundane purpose. Admittedly, the fact that similar punctured vessels belonging to 1st century CE Jerusalem have been discovered would suggest a cultic understanding, at least where the Judeans are concerned. But this, too, is mere conjecture. And here also we have specimens from earlier periods and places in the southern Levant. Judeans and Idumeans may have punctured their vessels for the same, to us, unknown reason. For the later rabbis, the altered pottery could no longer function in the usual way as a vessel, which suited them just fine, as now it could be considered pure. But why would that matter to the rabbis unless they knew that the now pure but damaged vessels could be repurposed somehow? Obviously, they were aware of some other practical function that such vessels served. Ian Stern is therefore likely correct when he observes that the perforated vessels, quote, reflect an early tradition, either Judean or Idumean, which was later transformed or adapted by the rabbis to a standardized normative Jewish ritual, end of quote. He is also correct when he asserts that the practices in question at Maresha may have been similar to later Judean practices, but it is possible that they had an entirely different purpose and symbolic meaning, albeit unknown to us. Again, end of quote. I would add that the transformations that occurred were gradual, not ones that Hyrcanus or any other political leader, high priest, necessarily initiated. Allow me in closing to again refer to my own research, if only to further support Ian's observations. Much of my recent writing, including my book on ritual purity at the intersection of text and material finds, and a more recent article, All Law Begins with Custom, Rabbinic Awareness of Popular Practice and its Implications for the Study of the Jews of Roman Palestine, has driven home that scholars need to resist the temptation to project the rabbis' understandings onto practices and institutions that clearly pre-existed them. The step pools that first appear circa 100 BCE evolved out of mimetically transmitted biblical purification practices that, together with indigenous beliefs and rites, informed everyday life and popular piety. These traditions and currents are what late Second Temple period Jews, especially those who formed textual communities, had to contend with and regulate, which allowed all sorts of cultural artifacts and practices to be incorporated into their own more regimented way of life. This eventually gets us to the rabbis and helps us understand what they too were up to. It was not the other way around. The rabbis were on the receiving end of competing beliefs, popular practices, and I might add, although not relevant to our discussion of the Maresha finds, exegetical traditions. Once we appreciate this dynamic, we can more readily see the Idumeans of Maresha and the Judeans of Jerusalem and environs for what they were, close neighbors with much in common despite their very obvious differences. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for this very diligent feedback, Stuart. And Ian, now we look forward to hearing your response to it.
Wow. First of all, the only thing I can say to react to would be, let's say, the punctured vessels, in my analysis at least, had no practical function. In other words, there were vessels at that period of time that were punctured deliberately, and they were used as planters, for hanging, all sorts of other, let's say, decorative things, but those were usually a specific type. Usually they were bowls or, let's say, jars, but it's almost impossible to explain why someone would puncture an oil lamp for some sort of functional purpose, or hanging it, or for that matter, a gungutaria. And so I really have concluded that it had to have some sort of ritual function, although again, I mean, I've thrown out the idea that maybe it has something to do with feasting. Initially, I thought that if it was connected initially to laws of purity, why not just break it? Okay, but the idea that you could actually, the rabbinic explanation in Mishnah Kelim of being able to possibly, mend it afterwards. And there are, by the way, holes called mending holes. These aren't mending holes either. But the idea that they could be reused at a certain point was fascinating. And again, I have to assume it is something, I believe it has something to do with ritual, but again, I wish I knew what the ritual was. I don't know what it is. I just think, as you said, I agree with most of your analysis. It's the symbolism. We cannot say what the symbolism was of the Idumeans, unfortunately. I mean, it would be really nice if we found some sort of codex or some sort from the Idumeans, but I don't, even though the amount of written material we've got in Maresha is unprecedented, but it's unfortunately it's bulos, it's ceilings, it's ostraca, and it's not giving us a lot of information. I've gone into all of what we found in terms of written material. We have a lot of divination texts that we found at Maresha, which again is not connected to, let's say, the rituals I've described, but we don't have texts that explain the rituals that appear to be, like you said, or like I think, as we agree in many ways. I believe that let's say, Bezalel Porton put it, there was an Idumean Judean piety, that there were certain shared rituals, and not everything has to be interpreted as ritual also. I agree with you there. The idea that they were, that the baths could have been used for just practical purposes certainly exists, and it could have had a dual purpose, let's put it that way. The vessels when I wrote the article on the vessels, I wrote it with Vered Noam. Vered Noam was a Talmudist, and she basically, in the conclusion, we diverged, and I said that I believe that this was proto-Mishnaic behavior. And she said that from her point of view, the idea of the Idumeans being familiar with the minutiae of the Mishnah was something that she could not, she could not accept. So we came up with two conclusions. So, I accept where she's coming from, but I don't necessarily agree with it. I don't know if is there something else I should have addressed? I'm not sure.
No, I concur with that. I think we agree more than we disagree on this.
I think so.
I not excluding the possibility of a ritual understanding. I'm just puzzled thinking from the rabbis backwards, which I argue extensively one should not do. But nevertheless, that the rabbi's logic doesn't make sense to me. In other words, why would you create something that's not a vessel unless as a non-vessel, it had some kind of use? For the same thing you're saying, just smash it and get rid of it altogether. It's got to have some kind of purpose. And in that case, it's clearly, to my mind, not going to be a ritual use any longer. So who knows? And I am puzzled by the fact that we're not just talking about storage vessels, cooking vessels, and so forth, and that really is a plus for your argument.
Well, I could say that just in terms of numbers, and I don't want to go into too many specifics, but let's say we found these punctured vessels in all of the caves. They never amount to more than 1 to 1.5% of the material we're finding. So it's not a overriding phenomenon, but it does exist, and it was not focused on one area. It made my life, it would be much more understandable, let's say, if we found all of these vessels in the area we're finding all these baths that we're finding. It doesn't work that way. We find it throughout the site. And right. So I don't have an explanation, but I can say that it was throughout and relatively small percentage.
I should also tell you that back in I think it was the late 80s, early 90s, we had a few vessels turn up at Tipori that had broken lips, and this was immediately suggested as a possibility, and I wasn't too keen on that thinking at the time.
Well, I can tell Ramla South, they found 3 cooking pots with holes in it, said, Judean site. Herod's Gate, they found the same thing. I mean, there's loads of places where they find the phenomenon and automatically the excavator says ethnic marker.
Right.
Those are Roman sites though, so I can't argue with that completely. Hellenistic, that's a different ballgame.
Right.
Ben, yeah, please.
Okay, first of all, thank you, Dean, thank you, Stuart, so much. This was a fascinating discussion. This site, it's just more fascinating to me than ever, and I have lots and lots of questions, but I'll just do one. Let's go back to the Josephus quote about Hyrcanus and the forced circumcisions. Since it seems likely, since there's evidence of the Edomites being circumcised to begin with, and since we're talking about Josephus, a later source, could we look at the possible motivations of Josephus to say that the Idumeans were forcibly converted, forcibly circumcised? And could that motivation have something to do with the Herodian line or with Herod, with the whole question of how Jewish was Herod or something like that? Let me try to say it like very simply. even though I'm probably wrong about all this, but my simple thought goes like this. You're not so Jewish, right? We had to force you to be Jewish, so don't claim that you're so Jewish, right? You're only Jewish because we made you. Don't think you're equal to us, something like that.
First of all, I think that we have to take a lot of things that Josephus says with a grain of salt. That's number one. I mean, he's very valuable. There's no doubt about it. But I don't think, for example, that we have a sense that, for example, even if we just take Maresha, that Maresha actually continues. And there's reference in Josephus to Maresha of Gabinius. Okay, that is to say the Roman governor, who ruled the area in the 50s. I've done a number of surveys with Dr. Michal Asband. As of yet, we have no evidence whatsoever of early Roman Maresha. So I use that as an example. Now, does Josephus have a prejudice towards the Hasmoneans? I believe he probably does have and that may be an explanation for it. But again, as I said, Strabo comes out against it. There is, I think Ptolemy does support the idea of forced conversion. So you've got a mixed bag here. Did they all practice circumcision? We can also go into what does it mean, circumcision? Was it a circumcision that we see today that is a total cutting off of the foreskin? Or was it more or less a symbolic, let's say, taking off of the foreskin like the Egyptians did, for example? And maybe this type, the circumcision that we're familiar with today is either a post, let's say, Hadrianic persecution phenomenon, although it could have been earlier. I don't know for sure. There's no doubt, though, aside from the fact that we found the phalli that were circumcised in Jeremiah 8 in the biblical text, there's reference to the Idumeans or the Edomites circumcision. So it's not a strange thing. Forced circumcision, again, I think that I wouldn't take Josephus at his word here. That's just the way I see it. I think that he has an axe to grind with the Hasmoneans.
So while the rest of us is thinking about further questions, may I also throw a set of questions at you, Ian, surrounding the question of what was the demographic situation shortly before 11211, and what then happened in 11211 that brought about the change reflected in the evidence. I was wondering about the decommissioning or blocking of rooms, of complexes that you have shown us, but I was wondering if I were about to leave my home for whatever reason, either out of fear, I would have to hurry, or out of despair or disillusionment, why would I bother to block rooms? Is that not? So no. So I'm thinking about the rationale of people who were, well, say, building the closure wall, and how we may interpret this in demographic terms. So that would be the first question to start with.
Okay, well then I don't think we can talk numbers, absolute numbers. Because we're estimating numbers, and the estimation I gave you of 10,000 is based on the number of water cisterns that were in use and the size of, or the approximate size of those cisterns, and how much water a person needs, etc., within the confines of that territory. So I'm not going to get into that right now, but what I'll say is that I think that, first of all, people leaving their homes, they weren't in 112, they left and they had to leave quickly. And in Area 53, we see that. Pottery was left on the floor. The tetradrach, they left the silver coins underneath their floor. They left very fast. But people in the, let's say, already beginning in the second quarter of the 2nd century BCE are leaving because of basically political turmoil, whether it is the revolt of the Maccabees and the wars that continue, whether it is the wars that are going on between the different usurpers, pretenders, I don't know what you might call them, going for the throne and competing for the throne and control of the Seleucid Empire. People would block up their homes, in my mind, believing that they're going to come back. I think those people are saying, I'm going to block this up. I'm going to come back here one day. I believe that's and it's a small percentage. I think it was like 12% of the blockages are deliberate. Now let's take, where are people going and why are they going? When, let's say, losing those economic opportunities, I'll just take the Columbaria as an example because they were somewhat traumatic. We find that there was a tremendous reduction in the number of dovecotes of Columbaria and Maresha. At the same time, in Judea, we see an increase in the number. Now, what's causing this? A couple of possibilities. Number one, the decrease, possibly because after the revolt, I believe that it's very possible that the Idumeans were exporting their turtle doves both in the direction of, let's say, Ashkelon, Aphrodite's favorite bird, but also for Jews in Judea. I believe once the rebellion takes place and there's an enmity between these two peoples, there could have been a boycott by the Judeans vis-a-vis the Idumean doves. Secondly, some of the Idumeans could have left. There's different, maybe it's the flip side of this coin. Idumeans flee, and some of them flee to Judea, and they bring with them the ability to build dovecotes and raise dovecotes there. So it goes in, it's two different possibilities there, but the blocking of the caves in my mind is, again, I can't put numbers. I can't say 5,000 left here or whatever. That's impossible. But clearly there's diminishing of the means of production, which would give people a some sort of a livelihood, and the fact that this reflected in the number of water systems, which is an absolute necessity, is the clear indicator in my mind that there's a reduction of numbers. But how many? Impossible to know.
Can I jump
Okay.
into the question related to Altay's?
Please.
About the 112, 111 date of abandonment. I mean, how certain is that as a sort of general population abandonment of the settlement, or given the kinds of evidence we're thinking about in terms of bullae and coins, is it just the case that the settlement does not remain an administrative center in the same way that it did before? And I'm asking this also with relation to Josephus's quite persistent mention of the continuation of Maresha as a settlement, not only in the Gabinius passage that you mentioned, but also, I mean, he quite explicitly states that Maresha is raised and destroyed by the Parthians when they invade.
Right. Again, in my mind, again, a very good example of Josephus being inaccurate. We have no sign of that whatsoever. We don't have a destruction level. We do not have a destruction level at Maresha. We have an abandonment, but not a destruction level. We have some desecration, as I showed you, but not destruction. So I think we have to take Josephus with a grain of salt. Very valuable, very important, but we have to look at him critically. When it comes to, what was your other point? In terms of the 112 BCE, after 112 BCE, we have 24 Hyrcanus coins out of thousands. Those are not, that's not a significant, that's an insignificant number. I mean, it could have been a couple of guys in that period of time going by on their donkey. Okay, we do not have anything. We have no Alexandriani coins, as far as I remember. Okay, so basically, yes, the area was not completely devoid of inhabitants. That doesn't happen in antiquity. Okay, some people continue to live there, and we see that. Even into the early Romans, in the time of Gabinius, there must have been a few people living there. There's no doubt about it. In the time of Bar Kokhba, clearly people were living there, but because we have about 8 systems underground that have burrows that resemble it, and I found some pottery there, pieces, but a number of, let's say, lamps and things like that underground that clearly are from that period of time. So there were people living in the area that continued, but the city as a city, okay, stopped. It was no longer there. And already by, I would say, the 2nd century, you have nearby Iliothropolis / Beit Guvrin. And again, let's go back to Josephus again. He talks about, Vespasian coming through there. There's no evidence of it. There's no evidence of the city existing at that period of time, of Beit Guvrin, Iliothropolis nearby. So I'm not trashing, Josephus here. I without him, we'd have no livelihood. But we still have to look at him critically.
Just out of interest, is there any evidence for a destruction layer in sort of 3940 BCE in the area? I mean, not Maresha necessarily. You mentioned that there wasn't one there, but any sense that, in a general sense, what Josephus is describing as Parthian destruction is going on anywhere? Or
There was, let's say, first of all, I can just say that I'm just thinking of destruction in the vicinity. Let's say in the area of Amuda, in the time of the Maccabees, you have destruction, okay? In Khirbet el-Rasim, which is nearby, you have evidence of destruction, but not Maresha. But these are small towns. Maresha is the big city. These are small, like villages at best.
Right. And you said during the Hasmonean period rather than during the Parthian.
Yeah, and in the Roman period, I don't have. I mean, I'm still looking for it. By the way, I haven't given up on that.
Thank you.
Sure.
Anyone else?
If I might ask, how many of the coins that are collected, how many of them would be Seleukid?
Okay. Well, the vast majority of the coins are Seleukid. I mean, I can't tell you, but hundreds, easy. I'm looking to see if I have my computer here just so I can show it to you, but I don't know if, where's that? Here we go. Let's see. See if I can get this, see myself, and then I can answer your question. Just something.
And those would those be primarily from Antiochus IV?
It's a mixed bag. It's a mixed bag. No, we've got it throughout. Let me just see if I can move this over a little, and I can look over here. I think I have a chart. I might not, but let's see. Not coming back. Let's see what this. Okay, here I'll give you numbers now. Okay, we have two 4th century coins. We have 135 Ptolemaic coins. We have 716 Seleucid coins. 2 Hyrcanus coins. That's actually, there's another 24 that were found up above by Bliss and McAllister. So and post Hyrcanus coins and unidentified Hasmonean coins 12. Okay, so we're not talking. So I'm not saying it was completely abandoned without anyone, but these numbers are pretty exact. Let me see if there's anything else here. 4 Alexandrian coins. Okay, so yeah, there were a few. That does not amount to I would call it, habitation. Really, could have just been people trading and walking by.
And what would those have been in jars or in hoards or just on the ground?
We found no, they were not on the ground, because on the ground, let's say we're talking about found inside or during the course of an excavation. I know that we found a hoard of Seleucid coins in cave 57. That was clumped together. There's also a Maresha mint at the time. Some coins that would be locally made, but I mean, if you're looking to go into the coins of Maresha, then look at Donald Ariel's work, because Donald has written a lot on it. I mean, we've published a lot. Some of it is in our final reports, but if you want to look at numismatic material from Maresha, Donald T. Ariel is your address.
Okay, thank you.
Guys, I hate to say goodbye, but it's almost 7 o'clock. I have to say goodbye. So
Okay.
I thank you all for your attention. And
Thank you. And Chag Sameach, thank you very much.
Chag Sameach. And Stuart, I want, if you can send me that last, you referred to an article, All Laws. If you could send that to me, I'd like to read it.
We'll do that.
Okay, thanks. Guys.
Chag
Thank you
Sameach.
very much, everybody. Thank you.
Take
Thank
care.
you. And thank you, Stuart.
Bye-bye now.
Thank you, Stuart. Chag Sameach.